extraordinary, the level in which my life has changed.
Fame introduced them to the world, but what came after was rarely seen. In their final interviews, they said things that didn't seem unusual at the time, sentences that felt normal, answers that felt expected. But later, those same words felt completely different. Not louder, not clearer, just heavier in a way no one noticed at the time. Promise and scope. This video looks at the final interviews of several well-known actors, moments that, in hindsight, revealed far more than anyone realized when they first aired. These weren't emotional confessions or dramatic turning points. No headlines came from them. No major reactions followed. Just conversations, simple, familiar, and easy to forget. Until time passed, and those same conversations started to feel like something else entirely. Cultural context. For decades, interviews have shaped how audiences understand the people they watch on screen. Late-night shows, press tours, behind-the-scenes features, all of it designed to create a complete picture. Not just of the work, but of the person behind it, especially during the height of global entertainment, when actors became more than performers. They became familiar. Their personalities, their habits, their voices, all part of how audiences connected with them. And interviews played a central role in that connection. They were controlled environments, structured conversations, carefully timed appearances. But even in controlled spaces, not everything stays controlled. Sometimes small things slip through. A pause that lasts just a second longer than expected. A shift in tone that doesn't quite match the question. A sentence that feels ordinary until you hear it again later. And when time passes, those small moments begin to stand out. Not because they were obvious, but because they weren't. 1. Heath Ledger. At the height of his career, Heath Ledger was known for a level of dedication that set him apart. He didn't just act in roles, he disappeared into them. Every performance carried intensity, focus, and a kind of commitment that audiences could feel, even without knowing why. And in interviews, he spoke about that process openly. About preparation, about immersion, about giving everything to the role. In one of his final interviews, the conversation turned towards sleep, or more specifically, the lack of it. He described nights where his mind wouldn't slow down, thoughts overlapping, ideas continuing long after the day had ended. He mentioned sleeping only a few hours at a time, not as a complaint, but almost as an observation. At the time, it sounded like dedication, like the cost of taking his work seriously. And in that context, it made sense. But looking back, it felt different. Not just like commitment, but like something heavier, a kind of exhaustion that didn't fully show on the surface. His tone remained calm, his answers steady. Nothing about the interview felt alarming. And that's exactly why it stayed unnoticed. Because sometimes, the most important details are the ones that don't stand out at all. And in hindsight, those quiet admissions carried more meaning than anyone realized. But his story wasn't the only one shaped this way. 2. Brittany Murphy. Brittany Murphy built her presence on energy. Bright, expressive, and constantly engaging, both on screen and in interviews. She had a way of filling space effortlessly, bringing a kind of lightness to every conversation she was part of. And for years, that energy remained consistent. Familiar, recognizable, expected. But in her later interviews, something began to shift. The energy was still there, but softer, more measured. She spoke a little slower, paused a little longer between thoughts. Her answers became more careful, not guarded, but deliberate. At the time, it didn't feel unusual. It felt like maturity, like someone evolving, settling into a different phase of life. But later, those small changes stood out because they didn't feel like performance anymore. They felt like effort to maintain the same presence people expected, even as something behind the scenes may have been changing. There were no dramatic moments in those interviews, no clear signals, just subtle shifts, easy to overlook in real time, but impossible to ignore in hindsight. Because sometimes what changes isn't what someone says, it's how they say it. When you place these interviews side by side, a pattern begins to form. Not in the details, but in the feeling. The tone becomes quieter. The energy becomes more controlled. Conversations shift away from long-term plans and move closer to the present moment. Part of this comes from the nature of the industry itself. Constant pressure, continuous visibility, the expectation to always appear composed, no matter what's happening privately. Over time, that pressure builds. And even in carefully structured interviews, it can show, not dramatically, but subtly. There's also the human side, health, fatigue, emotional weight. Things that don't always translate directly into words, but still influence how those words are delivered. And sometimes, there's something even less defined. A quiet awareness, not fully clear, not fully understood, but present enough to shape tone, pacing, and expression. And when we look back, those small details stop feeling random. They start to feel connected. 3. Paul Walker. Paul Walker's public image was built on calmness. Even at the height of global recognition, he carried himself differently, more grounded, more focused on life outside of fame. In interviews, that perspective was always present. He spoke about family, about balance, about stepping away when needed. And in one of his final interviews, that theme became even more noticeable. He talked about slowing down, about spending more time away from constant work, about focusing on what mattered beyond the spotlight. At the time, it felt natural, like someone reaching a point where priorities begin to shift. But later, those words carried a different weight. Not because they predicted anything, but because of how clearly they reflected where he was mentally. Calm, grounded, focused on something beyond the moment. And in hindsight, that clarity felt more significant than anyone realized. And he wasn't alone. 4. Robin Williams. Robin Williams was known for movement. Fast, unpredictable, and constantly creative. His interviews often felt like performances on their own, full of energy, humor, and rapid shifts in thought. But in his later appearances, that energy changed. It didn't disappear, but it slowed, became more controlled, more focused. He spoke more about reflection than momentum, about slowing down instead of speeding up, about appreciating smaller moments. At the time, it felt like balance, like someone finding a quieter version of themselves. But there were brief moments where that tone shifted even further, moments that passed quickly but stayed in memory later, because sometimes a small pause can change how everything feels in hindsight. Chadwick Boseman's final interviews are the ones that changed meaning the most over time. At the time, he was at the height of global recognition. His work had reached millions. His presence carried influence far beyond film. And in interviews, he spoke with clarity, purpose, and calm. But there was a recurring theme in his words. Time. He spoke about it often, about how valuable it was, how important it was to use it meaningfully. At the time, those statements felt inspirational, the kind of perspective expected from someone in his position. But later, they felt deeply personal, because behind the scenes, there was something the public didn't see. And yet, in the way he spoke, it was almost present, not directly explained, not openly acknowledged, but reflected in the weight of his words. There was no single moment where everything became clear, just a series of conversations that slowly took on new meaning. And that's what made those interviews unforgettable. Not because they revealed everything, but because they didn't need to. Taken together, these interviews reveal something subtle but powerful. The way people speak often changes before anything else does. Not in obvious ways, not in headlines, but in tone, in pauses, in the space between words. At the time, those moments feel ordinary, easy to miss, easy to forget. But with time, they become something else. Not explanations, not warnings, just reflections of where someone truly was in that moment. Stories like this are more common than most people realize. And the next one follows a strikingly similar path.